Hi, everybody. My name is Caitlin. I'm the events coordinator at Square Books. We're here tonight to talk about ZORRIE by Laird Hunt, and he's going to be joined in conversation with Cristina Henriquez. So before I hand it off to them, I just want to tell you a little bit about both of them. Laird Hunt is the author of 8 novels, a collection of stories, and 2 book-length translations from the French. He's been a finalist for the PEN/Faulkner Award for Fiction and won the Anisfield Wolf Award for Fiction, the Grand Prix de Littérature Américaine, and Italy's Bridge Prize. His reviews and essays have been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and many others. He teaches in the Literary Arts program at Brown University and lives in Providence. Christina Henriquez is the author of the novels The Book of Unknown Americans and The World in Half, and of the short story collection Come Together, Fall Apart. Her work has appeared in the New Yorker, the Atlantic, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times Magazine, and elsewhere. All right, we're so glad that you guys could join us, and we are just loving ZORRIE, hand selling it, and the New York Times book review has recently called it a virtuosic portrait of mid-century America itself. Congratulations on that write-up, Laird. All right, I'm going to go away and let y'all take it from here. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Caitlin.
Thank you. Well, thank you everybody who is joining us this evening, this afternoon, wherever your time zone is. I'm really excited to be doing this with Laird and to celebrate the publication of ZORRIE, which I thought was a beautiful, like exquisite book. And yeah, congratulations on the New York Times book review, which was just a rave, deservedly so. Laird and I, just as a little bit of background, were very fortunate to be able to judge the National Book Awards this past year, which is how we met each other. And I think we realized pretty quickly that we had a lot of overlap in our taste about writers and writing and novels. And so I'm really thrilled to be able to read this newest book from him and to join you all to talk about it tonight. So thanks for being here, Laird. Okay, so I have like lots of Post-it notes with all sorts of things that I want to talk to you about. But first, let's start with what everybody always seems to want to start with, which is, where did this book come from? How did it originate? What was the seed of it, and how did it grow?
Yeah, it's kind of a long saga. I mean, this typically for me a book takes, I don't know, sort of 3 or 4 years, and I reckon I can walk away from it. But this book actively has started about 17 years ago, and then the seed for it was planted a crazy 30 years ago, when I wrote a short story, really the first short story that I ever felt good about, which was called Old Woman. I was living in Japan, and I wrote this book about Indiana, or excuse me, the story about Indiana, about this woman who's peeling potatoes, preparing dinner, taking care with her work. And that really is ZORRIE Underwood. So there's a little note at the top that says 1990 on the manuscript that I still have.
Was that her name even then? Like that was actually her in that story?
Well, so she's not named. She's referred to throughout the piece as Old Woman. Okay. And for a long time, ZORRIE, the manuscript, was called Old Woman. So that's how I know that was actually her first incarnation, was 30 years ago. And then that 17 years ago, I don't know if it's 18, maybe it's 17, I'm not sure, but the character of ZORRIE steps out of this other work of mine. She has a small role to play in a novel I wrote called Indiana, Indiana, a very early book. And she's referred to as the woman next door. She gets her name in the book. And I just was so intrigued by her that I thought, I've got to try and write her story. And writing it actively took all those years, which was kind of great, and then also really frustrating at times, because I liked her so much and I couldn't.
Did you hear her? Did you hear like her voice, or what was it that was compelling you, that was drawing you to her, you think?
You know, it's funny. Oftentimes it is a voice for me with a character. I'll get the voice and I just have to follow it. In this case, it was an image of a determined woman standing under a crabapple tree on a summer afternoon, who has something in mind that she wants to do. She wants to talk to someone. And that's a scene that kind of plays out actually in both books, but in ZORRIE, it's a kind of culminating scene. She's finally worked up the courage to do something and she's determined to do it, for better or worse. And so for me, it was very visual. And out of that, and maybe that's why the book is written in third person. I'm not in her point of view. I'm looking at her from the outside, but I look at her pretty closely.
You can see her. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
that visual idea of her. That scene that you mentioned is one of my favorite scenes in this book. And I mean, for a book that I've seen it described as being spare, I've seen it described as being quiet. I mean, I'm a person who loves a book that is essentially sort of plotless. You know, like I go to books for the writing, and that's what this book serves up in such sumptuous detail. But even with that said, that scene where she is standing under the tree and has something she wants to say, I mean, I was like flipping pages. Like I was like, I need to, like, what's gonna happen to her? I felt so intensely connected to her in that scene. So despite the fact that there's not these sort of like big dramatic moments, there is drama nonetheless that's just thrumming under all of those words. And I thought that was really spectacular. I wonder, actually, now that I've said it, what do you think of the word quiet, especially as it's used as a descriptor, perhaps for this book or your work?
You know, it's what it's making, what came into my mind when you said that was a Sunday afternoon in the 1980s, rural Indiana, and I was at church with my grandmother. Could have been many Sundays, and it was a church that was largely populated by older women because the men had died or run off, but mostly they had passed away, and it was sort of the moments between the different things that were going on during the service, where heads were bowed or people were fishing around in their pocketbooks to get a tissue or a candy because they had a tickle in their throat. And it's that kind of quiet, and maybe it's because you use the word thrumming, in which there's all this undercurrent, because it was a church that was populated by people who had lived these rich lives that they were quite proud of, and weren't most of them shy to talk about, but they could also get really quiet when it was time to be quiet. And so for me, it's a kind of quiet that's really just rich with all kinds of history, with all kinds of memory and possibility, in a sense. And I was this, I was a teenager, in the midst of all of these women who in many ways became the inspiration for ZORRIE some years later.
Yeah. What is, you said you wrote this short story, Old Woman, when you were in Japan, a short story about Indiana. What is your connection to Indiana? Let's start with that.
Sure. So my family.
Where this book is set.
Sorry, what?
Which is where this book is set.
Yeah, where the book is set. Yeah. So family connection goes back to the mid 19th century in rural Indiana. So my grandmother's ancestors had a land grant from the government that they took out. And so that's the kind of familial connection to that part of the world. So it goes back a little while. And then my own personal connection is that when I was 13, my parents had split up, and there was this idea that I should be sent to Indiana to live with my grandmother. And I loved the farm. She had a farm and she oversaw it. She lived there by herself. And so this idea of this kid, I was at that moment in London, England, living with my father and stepmother and sister. And this idea that suddenly I would have an 80-acre backyard to run around in. Seemed pretty great. But man, it was a rough landing to go from London. I'd been in the Netherlands before, to this Indiana community that was really quite tight knit. And because I was Helen Hunt's grandson, I was folded in pretty well. And I was a little bit sporty at the time, and so I did okay with the kids at school by and large. But I wasn't church going at all, and suddenly I was obliged to, and it was challenging. And yet I was there for 5 years with my grandmother, and then I went to Indiana University, so there was another 4 years where it was my base, and and I'd never lived anywhere for longer than a few years before that, so it really. I sunk roots into the landscape, into that community in a way that I didn't realize it, but really stuck with me. And that became a kind of core, emotional, physical core for me.
Yeah, I mean, so like ZORRIE, who can't seem to, she gets away from Indiana at times, but always comes back to Indiana and has a real groundedness, a real rootedness there. It sounds like it's a place that did the same thing sort of for you.
Yeah, I think so. And
I used to live in Indiana too.
You did?
Yeah.
Whereabouts?
In Terre Haute.
Oh, no kid, Terre Haute. Oh,
yeah, just for about a year and a half or so. But it was interesting to see then Indiana represented in a novel and be like, yeah. So I was actually sort of curious just from a selfish standpoint, like what your connection was, given that I had lived there.
Yeah, absolutely. Terre Haute. I went with one of a graduate of my high school, Clinton Central High School, went to ISU, Indiana State in Terre Haute. And so we went down a few times to see basketball games. It's about an hour and a half from where I lived, not too far away.
Another writer who writes about sort of the middle of the country that I know you and I both love is Marilyn Robinson. And interestingly, so when I was doing my research and sort of reading other people's reviews of this book and what people were saying on Goodreads about ZORRIE, there were a few authors who came up again and again, and they were like William Maxwell, Brad Watson, Kent Harif, but I hadn't seen anybody bring up Marilyn Robinson, although this book, I will tell you, reminded me so much of Lila in a certain way. Partly because, and I'm interested to hear that like this is a character that had a cameo in an earlier book, which is similar to what happens for Lila, right? She becomes her own character in that book. But I wanted you to talk perhaps about, you don't have to talk about Marilyn necessarily, but just the attention that I think both of you have, and this is what reminds me, you of her, she of you, the attention to a sentence, right? That I find so like captivating. It's the reason that I go to fiction, really, right? It's the reason that I go to poetry too. Do you read poetry?
Yeah, I'm married to a poet, for one thing, Eleni Sikelianos, but it was actually poetry in a sense that brought us together, because I went to grad school to do fiction, but I found myself just being interested only in reading poetry, and that habit has stuck with me. I mean, I certainly read a lot more fiction now, and I'm not reading as much poetry as I once did, perhaps, but man, I love it.
It's in there. You can always tell the fiction writers who read poetry.
Yeah, I've never tried to write it, or actually I have tried to write it. Let's put it that way.
And how did it go?
Not so well. Don't quit your day job was kind of how it went, but it definitely infuses my work. And a writer like Marilyn Robinson, you just feel the undercurrents of that attention to language, whether she is getting it through philosophy, through reading and rereading the Bible in such a fascinating way, and it's that kind of writer and that kind of writing that really makes me excited to try my own hand at it. So that when I read Gilead, where Lila first appears, it was really like a thunderbolt. I mean, I knew housekeeping, but Gilead for me was just, you know, one of those big books that I read and reread,
Yeah.
and probably was influenced in the drafting of ZORRIE by that discovery, in the sense that I knew I needed to go in and make those sentences better. I needed to work and rework until I could, you know, feel like that they were, I don't know, they were solid on the page in some way.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it rises to the level of music. It's interesting that you're saying that perhaps reading something like Gilead inspired you to feel like you need to do better on your own senses, because frankly, like for me as a writer, reading something like ZORRIE made me feel the same way. Like I need to go back to my own work and really think about those sentences. I'm curious, how long do you typically spend on a sentence?
Mm. I think I tend to go through something like ZORRIE would have been, would have gone through maybe a dozen or 15 serious drafts. And
Okay.
each time, you know, we're talking 17 years or whatever. So, but each time I would be looking at the sentences. So I don't know, you know, how much I sit there and look at it, but over time, you know, there's an accumulation of attention to the language that is almost meditative in a way. When it's not going well, when you know something isn't right, it's harrowing. But over time, looking at them, start getting closer to something that you're satisfied with. Again, I don't always do this. It was really just with this book, which is, you know, it's very, you know, it's not a long book at all those years of working
And
on
yet
it.
you cover her whole life, but yeah.
Her life is covered, but it's the compression. But yeah, so sentences, they have to be there, and then everything else comes out of that, for me, just generally speaking.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think I saw Toni Morrison once, and somebody asked her, like, how did you come into the language? And she said something about how it's always, always difficult. But once you can get that first sentence, then, you know, you're good after that.
It's so great that you mentioned Morrison, because when I was getting into the home stretch on the manuscript, and Eleni, my wife, was giving it a read, she was also reading Sula by Toni Morrison.
Huh.
And there was just this slight sense of, you still need to go a little farther, my friend. You know, I mean, Sula in one hand and then my manuscript in the other. That's tough. But it was really lovely to go. So I went and I plunged in myself once the book had been liberated. And wow, talk about someone else who could really write a sentence.
Yeah, a sentence.
Robinson, Morrison, these are great masters at that level, as well as the larger picture.
For sure. Yeah, to learn from on every level. Yeah. So did your wife often read your work?
She does, and it's a great, and I've already used the word harrowing, but I'll use it once again, because she's a fierce.
You see your attention to the sentences. You can hear. You're like, oh no, I used that word. I can use.
I need another one.
You're a writer. Yeah.
No, she's a great editor, and I'm really lucky to have that first close reading.
Let's talk a little bit about the research that went into writing this. I'm working on a book right now that is very research intensive. So I hope you will tell me everything you know and learned about research. But I guess one question is, what did you learn about radium, which plays a big role in the story? And then not only what did you learn, but how did you go about learning it?
Yeah, so there's a passage or a section fairly early in the book where ZORRIE, who's at loose ends, drifts one state over to Illinois, to the town of Ottawa, not to be confused with the Canadian city, where there is a luminous dial painting company, there was an actual company in Ottawa, where largely young women painted with radium paint. They painted the numbers on clock faces so that they would glow in the dark. And they did this both for commercial market and then also for military application as well. So in cockpits of planes and so forth. And it was good money. The young women made good money, maybe more money than anyone in their family was making. And they were told over and over again that this was a wonderfully safe thing to do. People were drinking radium tonics at the time, and often as a sort of demonstration of the safety, a supervisor might take a spoonful of radium powder and eat it. Mm-hmm. And girls, as they were called, the radium girls, were encouraged to take some, in the early days especially, take some of the paint home and decorate your house. So there's stories of people, painting the cribs of their babies with this radioactive substance. And I learned a lot about this through the work of Claudia Clark, Kate Moore, who both have wonderful overview books about the radium girls, as they were known. And then there's an amazing documentary that you can still find by Carol Langer on YouTube. I wasn't able to find it anywhere else, but it has
YouTube is a very underappreciated resource. Yeah.
It's really great. Yeah. But it has interviews with some of the women who I think it was made in the 80s, and they were into their silver years by then, but who had been through this, who had survived, but it hadn't been easy. And so it was a combination of sort of reading about it and watching things. And then I also made a trip to Ottawa, Illinois. And I had heard that the graves of the young women who had died from this would set a Geiger counter going. And I brought a Geiger counter, and indeed, it just lit it up all those years later. So they are still hot, crackling underneath the ground. And so that was very important to me, to spend time in Ottawa, and then to do that research. And then there's the research of the imagination. Once you've gotten some facts and gotten the architecture of the thing, then you can start to dance within those constraints.
Yeah. Do you feel in general, like, is there a danger of doing too much research? Mm-hmm. Could you go over, you know what I mean, and get bogged down in all of those facts? At some point, you have to always remind yourself, right? It's about this character, this character, this character. And you use that research to fill up that character in the story. But there seems to me to be some kind of line, and you don't know until you've sort of come up to it or even past it sometimes. Like, okay, now I've done too much. I sort of know too much for a fictional project, at least.
Definitely. I think, that was really important to me early on. I was doing research for an earlier novel called Never Home, which is about a woman who disguises herself as a man and goes to fight in the Civil War. And it was based on all this amazing research, because the scholarship is ever growing. So hundreds of women did this for both the North and the South. And they had all kinds of backgrounds, and it was really fascinating stuff. And it would have been really easy to sink the ship of the novel by just nothing but chock-a-block details. And Civil War is one example, but there are many other examples of, we've probably all encountered versions of this, historical novels that go into great detail on the kind of buttons that are on the coats of people, and people sort of clank into the room with all this, detail, right? And
because sometimes you find the best stuff and you're like, I just have to figure out a way to get it in here.
Yeah, I've always gone with the less is more. It's really important to have a few things to hit it, to make it real, in a sense. But probably, save some of that chock-a-block stuff for the side essay is kind of how I've approached it, or for a nonfiction project or something like that.
One of the characters who's really important to ZORRIE early in the book, and who has a resonance that kind of lasts throughout the book, is her teacher, Mr. Thomas. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about him, and also if there were any teachers in your life who were particularly impactful. And also, I know you teach now. And like, I don't know, maybe some of the things that you find yourself telling your students again and again, or the things that you see in your students.
Yeah, it's so Mr. Thomas is an homage to my own rural Indiana teacher whose name was Mr. Thomas. We called him Mr. T.
I want to tell you that the best teacher I ever had in my life was my teacher in Indiana also.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, my 4th grade teacher, Miss Artist, yeah.
Oh my gosh, wow, we have that in common. Yeah, we called him Mr. T. This was before the A-team and all of that happened. And and part of what was poignant to me about him was he was just about to retire. He was an older teacher, in many ways not like the Mr. Thomas who is in the novel, but he was unfailingly kind. And I was brand new. This was my first year in Indiana. I was feeling pretty adrift. And he was really good at sort of seeing me. I felt seen within that, not as someone who had beamed in from Europe or something like that, but just as a kid who was worth exchanging a word or two with. And then he died soon afterwards. So he had his longed for retirement, and then he passed away. And so something about that stuck with me, and it was really important to when there was the possibility of naming this teacher right away. It seemed like the teacher in ZORRIE had to be Mr. Thomas. And I think it's that that aspect of Mr. Thomas, my Mr. Thomas, and maybe the one of the novel as well, that informs hopefully what I bring to I actually just came from a class before we started this, and really trying, even in the virtual spaces we're in now, really trying to see these individuals, to hear them, and to give them, and to fight in a way for their space, for their presence at all times, even if it's just sort of implicitly. It has been really important to me. And hopefully what I can transmit. And so, yeah, so maybe someday there'll be a Mr. Hunt
in someone's future novel.
Yeah, how about it, some teacher?
Yeah, you never know. Can we talk quickly about the chapter titles, which again is something that's been on my mind. And I pulled down a bunch of books from my own bookshelves the other day, like contemporary novels, to try to see, because I had this thought that people don't really title chapters anymore. They either will get the name of a character or they'll get just sort of a number, but they don't usually get titles anymore. And so I was so interested to see these titles, which again were very poetic. And then I learned, I think they're from Virginia Woolf, but correct me if I'm wrong. And I just thought I wanted you to talk a little bit about how those worked their way into the book, what you were thinking about.
Yeah, so I can just read a couple of them. The first one is Out of the Shadow into the Sun. That's chapter 1. Chapter 2 is Running Together, the Days Fall Copiously. And then chapter 3 is No Shining Roof or Glittering Window. And yeah, those are from Virginia Woolf. They're from The Waves. And the idea with them, so they were there from the very beginning. And the idea of having Woolf in the book, haunting it, came from the fact that my rural Indiana grandmother had a library, as so many of the people in the community did, that was sort of a kind of, not really a sanctified space, but a space of seriousness in a way that mattered. That notion of erudition, of literature counting in some deep way, that poetry was important, philosophy, novels. And on my grandmother's shelf was Virginia Woolf, among others, right? But I wanted to have some acknowledgement without, the book has books. It's a book that contains references to books, but I wanted to have some haunting of the language without, sort of oversaying it. And as I say, it was there from the very beginning, all those years ago. But it was one of the few things that withstood the process of the years of stripping away, of changing, of swapping out whole sections. But those chapter titles stayed.
Yeah, those are the things that then become sort of like your guiding stars as you're writing, I think.
For sure.
Okay, I'm going to do a quick lightning round with you. And then I think we may have some questions from the audience that I want to get to. Okay. Describe your writing space.
It's currently a second floor library. I write in a library that has poetry and fiction. And the window that I look out onto this street, Freeman Parkway, has calorie pear trees that blossom beautifully in the springtime.
Oh, that sounds lovely. What is the first book that you read and loved?
Watership Down by Richard Adams. I read it 11 times.
Wow.
Little
book
obsessive.
You read the most?
Yeah, I'm afraid it still is.
Yeah. Okay. Do you write on the computer or by hand?
These days, largely by hand, but when I first drafted ZORRIE, it would have initially, at least the opening pages, been by hand.
Why the change, like these days? You say these days by hand. What has changed?
My handwriting has gotten worse and worse over the years, so that it's almost laborious to do, which is very sad to me. It started out pretty bad, and now it's really bad, and so it was just a cumbersome process. But I still take notes in notebooks with ideas with a pen, but I tend to draft these days with a computer.
Okay. What was your first job?
Pizza Hut, Frankfurt, Indiana. Actually, that's my second job. My first job was detasseling corn in the surrounding fields.
Oh, wow. I saw just now someone popped up, so I'll add this to the lightning round. What is your work routine?
That also has shifted since my daughter came into the world 15 years ago. I used to be a late night writer, perhaps with a glass of wine in hand.
How late? You would start at what time?
11ish, and then run till 1 or something like that. Those are the hours my wife's Laney still likes to keep, and so I shifted when our daughter came around. I was often the earliest morning guy in her first days, and that just kind of got into my mind. So I would get up maybe at 4 or 5 to get a little bit of work done, and then it was time to hang with our lovely kiddo. And that has sort of stuck with me, so that now I do most of my writing in the morning, and I can revise a little bit at night, but I can't do any drafting.
Still at like 4 or 5 in the morning? That early?
No, that was a momentary thing. I'm pleased to say. But in a way, it's funny because those are farm hours, right? That's when my grandmother would get up at 4:30 or 5 and get going on the day. But no, I don't go that far anymore.
Yeah. Would you be so kind as to read maybe just 1 or 2 pages so that we can hear all the language that we've been talking about, and then we'll do a few questions from the audience.
Sure, yeah. I thought maybe I'd read the scene that comes right after the one that we first evoked, where ZORRIE is standing under the crabapple tree, and she's done the thing she wants to do, and now there is the aftermath of it. And so it's late in the book, and I won't set it up any more than that, but you'll just get a sense of the landscape and maybe some of the texture of the sentences. Well before dawn, when the fresh storm had settled into heavy rain, she pulled the truck out and drove it past the dark Summers house, east along 28 as far as the Kempton turnoff, then north through town where the rain beat off the roofs of the cars, deepened puddles on the asphalt, and fell in thick streams past the ornamental trees and porch lights with their fancy globes. She kept heading north for a time, skirted a cemetery she'd always thought was pretty and had always meant to stop in and visit, then rode along flat, houseless roads that had only the beans and corn and occasional summer wheat growing up along their borders to distinguish them. She drove fast at first, leaning up over the steering wheel, her tires skidding and crunching the wet gravel. But after a while, she felt foolish and more conspicuous than she liked, even if it was still so early, and she eased off. Her thought had been to ride around in the dark and rain near home until she could wake up and think straight, or at least start to think, but she had run through forest past Gus and Bessie's house and the church that had long since stopped having any particular meaning, besides pale memories for her looking gray and lonely in the drenched half-light. And still her mind wasn't offering her anything like help. So after a while, she dropped down onto Division Road and took it west, then headed up or over around Rossville past the corner where Mr. Thomas's schoolhouse had stood until someone had knocked it down for its brick and chimney stone, and along a stretch of road that once led to her aunt's house and now led nowhere in particular because it too had been knocked down, its foundations dug up and soybeans planted over it. As she drove, she held her teeth clenched tight and held them clenched long after she'd registered that doing so was not accomplishing anything at all. So it's just a little taste.
With incredible interiority that you get into her. And I think, like, to me, that's the great advantage that fiction has over any other medium, right? You can have these long stretches where you're really just so deep into somebody else's consciousness. And you give us that, I think, in such a close and pleasurable way. That it's quite stunning. So
Thank you.
I think we have some questions from the audience. I don't know if Caitlin wants to.
Yeah, we've got, I've got a couple, but we'll start with an attendee's question. Claire would like to know, how do you negotiate writing about a place that has so many personal associations, but where you no longer live?
Yeah, so it was kind of a balancing act, in a way, acknowledging that my sense of the place was growing less immediate with the passage of years. But it was mitigated by frequent returns. So as a matter of fact, I even did a pandemic road trip with my aforementioned daughter this summer, and we spent time in rural Indiana on the farm. So even though my grandmother has now left, she left the farm as a great gift to all of us, and so we all have a key to the farmhouse. And my bedroom is shamefully much like it was when I was living there in the 1980s. It's a little strange. But just to say that I go back fairly frequently, but I don't pretend to an expertise that someone who's there all the time would have. But maybe that slight outsider's perspective that I even had when I was a kid, right? It came from somewhere else. Has allowed me to see different types of things, not better things, but just see it all just a little bit differently from a little bit of a remove. That could be useful.
Definitely.
I rewatched I Am Not Your Negro the other day, James Baldwin, and there's a part in it where he talks about his responsibility is as a witness, and sort of positioning himself a little bit as outside, but being able to see. And I think that is an important distinction that is probably part of the reason your entry path to be able to write about that place, because you were both part and not part of it. Yeah,
for sure.
And so I've got one. So I mean, ZORRIE was she was with you in your head, your heart, whatever you want to say, for years and years and years, but like here she is, like out in the world in this book. So do you still kind of, I don't mean to be like metaphysical about it, but like is she still there with you, or do you, I don't know, how do you put that down or put that aside, or do you do that?
She's definitely still here, and I kind of think that she'll be riding along with me for a good while. I mean, I've had some central characters who wouldn't leave, and I really wanted them to go. They weren't such pleasant company, but this is someone who, she's awfully nice to spend time with, and it feels, I don't think I'll necessarily return to this landscape in my writing, but I feel like there's something about the afterglow of this character that is almost like a balm for me. It's almost thinking about ZORRIE. I can think about being in that rural Indiana landscape as I knew it, which in the first instance was as a safe haven, a harbor from difficult circumstance, a kind of, it was my home base. And no one could get me when I was there. And so this character who has aspects of my grandmother, aspects of those older women in the community that I evoked near the start, it feels kind of good to be in her presence. So I'm hoping she may take off, but I'm hoping she'll stay a little bit longer.
Yeah.
How did you come up with her name?
I was trying to remember that because it's in that previous novel, which was published in 2003. I think I got her first name off of a gravestone in Clinton County, ZORRIE. It's not a common name in that area, but it's not unheard of either. And then her last name, my mother was asking me about this just recently. One of her best friends from her youth, her pre-married name was Underwood, but I'm not quite sure how the combination got made. It was one of those. It's probably in a notebook somewhere, but it's been so long I can't remember.
It's such a strong name. Yeah.
Well, I think you've given our readers and it's such a gift to have, because you talked about how she's this kind of comforting, reassuring companion, and just kind of, again, you guys discussed this earlier, but just kind of the interiority and the attention to kind of that specific detail that makes, like, it's funny because it makes you, that's like what makes everyone so human, is that specific detail that you can kind of universally relate to, which I realize is kind of like an oxymoron, but I feel like, and especially kind of in this moment, this to kind of zero in and be quiet and just have that is so great. And we're just so glad that you put all that work in, and we've got it here. So I think if y'all want to, maybe if you have any like final closing remarks, we can wrap it up. Oh, hold on, we've I think this is your wife. Maybe this will be our last question. Can Laird discuss a character who he wanted to leave? Good question.
Well, yeah. So I had a series of narrators who I did write from the first person in these novels that are set sort of in the past. I mentioned the one about the Civil War. There was an earlier, very troubled narrator of a book called Kind One. Her name is Ginny Lancaster, and also sometimes she's known as Scary Sue. And maybe that says enough in a way, but she had quite a story to tell, and it was a very, very dark story with some shimmers of light, I suppose, within it, and redemption. But boy, she didn't want to leave, and I was often encouraging her to make her way to the door. And the only thing that would, finally dislodged her was that these other voices from these other books came along that were just as fierce in a way and kind of knocked her to the side. But they all had their own problems. None of them are as nice as ZORRIE.
Can I ask one more question? Do we have time? Okay.
Yeah.
Because I was consulting my Post-it notes and I saw in the acknowledgements you talked about certain books that you had close to as you were working, which is something that I do too. I sort of like make my little nest of books, whether or not I'm reading them, but they're just sort of like around me somehow. And I wanted to know, is that something you do for every book? Do you sort of build that little nest?
Yeah, and sometimes it's literal as you're describing, and then sometimes it's more just that I'm constantly returning to them in my mind.
Yeah.
But I definitely like to have sort of the instruments of my imagination and my imaginative process near me, the books that have been important, some of the tools of the endeavor. I've got this pen nib holder that I keep kind of close. This is my work office, but I like to, even here, I like to have that. So, something that you dip into ink, and I will often revise that way by dipping and using that kind of pen for that process. And I have a postcard that has the title of a book by Yasunari Kawabata called Beauty and Sadness, right by my desk where I work at home, that window that looks out into the pear trees. And that was key for Indiana. Indiana is key for ZORRIE, that notion of the combination, both beauty and sadness, and one not having the upper hand over the other.
Are you sort of superstitious about those things?
A little bit. I err on this. I have too much of my grandmother's practicality to go too far down that road. I confess to being just a little bit, sometimes overly attentive to making sure that those things are right.
I was happy to see like your pen, for example, because I'm very like particular, and I'm glad to know I'm not the only one.
You're not alone.
I need this sort of pen, and I need this thing right here, and yeah, there's all that sort of feeling.
For sure.
Goes into the magic of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much.
No, thank you. Thank you for writing this incredible book, which I hope everyone will go read by.
We've got signed bookplate editions. Thank you for that, Laird.
Oh yeah. Absolutely.
And we're so glad that y'all could join us, and everybody who's watching. I hope everyone's staying warm and safe, and y'all take care. Thanks so much. Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.